thank you for rising to be here, and thank you for those words and from the kind words from my friends. All right, I don't have a lot of time, and I talk fast, so I'm sorry. I'm going to talk fast because I really have a lot to share with you today. And I want to talk, as you can see from the title, about culture, about life, about research, and about how we integrate into community. That's really what I study, is how we integrate into community, and I've applied that to lots of different circumstances. I wanted to start with this quote, which I feel really guides a lot of the work that I do. It says that humankind has not woven the web of life, but are but one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound together, all things connect. This idea that we're all connected, interconnected in this room right now, is something that I think is pretty obvious to the people in this room, but let me tell you, I walk into rooms all the time, large audiences. I was just at the Global Climate Action Summit, and they're missing it completely. And the reason why is because that knowledge is in this kind of room. It's in the diversity and in our deep, old heritage of knowing interconnectedness. And this really has guided the work that I have done. So just to give you a little bit of context of who I am, all four of my grandparents were born in Mexico. My parents were born in Orange County. And the picture down at the bottom is my grandparents, my grandma and grandpa on my mom's side. They really helped to raise me. My mom was only 20 when I was born, and my dad was 21. So my grandparents were kind of the older stability in my life as I was growing up. My grandmother just passed away in January. She was 94. And my grandfather passed away 2 years ago. He was 93. I miss them. But they taught me a lot about interconnection. They taught me a lot about how we rely on each other as we go through life. My other grandparents were migrant workers. They came in during the revolutions. My grandfather picked oranges. My dad picked oranges in Orange County. And so my background is really has both kind of educated, but also the farm worker kind of background, that many of you probably have in your own families. One unique thing about my background, I think, is that my parents were somewhat educated. As I was growing, my mom went back to school and got her bachelor's degree, and my dad got his master's degree. But somehow, in spite of all of that, when I was in high school, I was on welfare. AFDC, I don't know if you can recognize the food stamps, but those are what we used to buy food when I was in high school. And when I got to college, my personal income with my financial aid was higher than my household income had been in high school. So I thought I had hit the jackpot when I got to college. I was like, wow, I can buy my own sewing machine. I was really excited. The last picture on here is The Cry of Hope, and that is a book that my dad wrote. And one of the things about that is that my dad, although now is a clinical psychologist and got his PhD when I was in my early 20s, he was an alcoholic and a drug user through a lot of my growing up time. And so I really had to learn to rely on other family members and to create the stability that moved me forward. So my story is probably not unique in this room. I'm sure many of you have lots of stories of reasons why you statistically should not be in this room, you statistically should not be succeeding. And I just want to give you that little bit of background. I don't really like talking about myself, but I want to give it to you to let you know that these things that can become excuses for not succeeding can also become the strength that allows us to succeed. And we can't let them become excuses. So a funny thing happened. I told my counselor in high school, I went to a high school where like only 14% of the students went on to a 4-year college. So it was a tough high school. And I went to the counselor and said I wanted to go to UC Berkeley, and she said, oh, you won't get in, don't bother trying. And that was kind of tells you a little bit about myself, because when she said that, I was like, I'm getting in. Like, she says I can't do it, I'm going to do it. So I applied and I got in, and I went to UC Berkeley, and while I was there, I was able to do an education abroad program in my junior year. And I went and lived in England, and I traveled to the Soviet Union, and I got to see the world. When I finished, I took a year out and I worked for an environmental group, the PIRGs, Public Interest Research Group. And at that point, several people had told me about a professor at Harvard that they thought would resonate with the work that I was interested in. I was interested in conflict resolution at the time. And so I applied to Harvard assuming there's no way I'm going to get in, But I'll apply to it, I'll find out why they're going to reject me, and then I'll spend the next couple of years getting some experience, and then I'll apply again, and then I'll get in. And much to my surprise, I got in the first time. So I ended up at Harvard, which was totally not on my radar. Never thought that that was going to happen. So the top picture in there is with my dad at graduation from Cal, and then the bottom picture is with my mom and my dad, and my oldest son, Elio, when I was at Harvard. So the picture of Elio, Elio's right here, actually. I brought him here with me. So when I was doing my PhD program, I got married, and I had a baby, and people were saying there was no way I could finish, or that I remember people saying that kind of basically were writing me off. And I felt like, well, they think I'm going to finish. That's a good reason to finish, to prove them wrong, right? So I was motivated to do that. And one thing you can't tell from that picture from Harvard graduation is that I was pregnant with my second child at that point. The other thing you can't tell from that picture is how extremely tired I was. I was really not enthused about academia. I had been to Berkeley, I'd been to Harvard. They were highly competitive places. It was very isolating. I didn't know about SACNAS at that time. I would have been shocked that there were rooms like this at that time. And so when I finished at Harvard, I dropped out. I didn't look for a job. I had another child. By the end, I had 3. Those are my 3 boys up in the top corner. And I was done. And I was done for about 10 years. I did a little bit of adjunct teaching at the local university, moved back to California to be near my family, and I just thought, I don't want to be in this competitive, toxic environment where everybody's out for themselves. It was not something that I wanted to be a part of. But somehow I made my way back into academia, and that last picture is me with some students at Cal State San Marcos when they were graduating. So they talk about the pipeline, and they talk about how people go through. Well, you know, there's a traditional way of going through, and then there's kind of our way, right, or my way. So I took some caveats. I was off, and I did the environmental group work for a year, and then I took 10 years out, and somehow came back, and it was not intentional. I ended up doing a postdoc that was funded through NIGMS, through the Moore, when Cliff was there. Cliff is probably the person who's known me the longest in this room, and he saw me at the very beginning when I was coming back, and I definitely wasn't sure that I was going to stay back. And then now I've been, as you can tell from the description of what I've been doing, there's been a lot going on. And to give you a sense of how much time that has taken, you saw the picture of the little kids. These are the boys now. They're a lot bigger. Actually, the little one, the youngest one, is now even taller. That's almost a year ago, so just wanted to give you a sense of that. So me leaving academia, me rejecting it, feeling like it's not a part of me, really reminds me of how we are all interconnected, that we are creating a web, but that web can sometimes be very broken. And in the academic settings, we often experience that brokenness. And I wanted to understand that brokenness very much. My way back in was through doing some adjunct teaching at Cal State San Marcos. And Wes Schultz, whose picture is on the top here, he was teaching there at Cal State San Marcos, and he had just gotten this grant for the science study. And he approached me and said, why don't you come and help work on this with me? And I have to tell you, he asked me 3 times. I rejected him twice. And on the 3rd time, I finally said, OK, I'll come work with you. And we ran this study for 12 years, for 11 years of data collection. And I'm going to tell you really quickly about some of the findings that we have from that, so going a little bit away from my own thinking or my own life. And then I want to veer back over to what the implications are from the research. So I'm going to do a little bit of data. Stick with me. But then I'll come back to why it's relevant to all of us. So this study took place over 11 years. The participants were 1,400 students, half of which were from RISE programs, undergraduate research programs that were funded by NIH. I'm not going to go into full detail about it, but they're from 50 different universities across the United States. And people filled out surveys twice a year. And we had about 70% retention rate across the 11 years of the study. So it's a pretty significant study. And one of the things that I was really interested in was not about how do you change the students so that they are more likely to continue on, but I was really interested about this interplay between the STEM community, our discipline communities, and the individual, and how this interacts, right? How is it connected together? And how do we study that and understand it better and understand when it's not working? So Herb Kelman was my advisor at Harvard, and the theory that he used was the tripartite integration model of social influence. And This may look complicated, but let me just tell you, this is pretty simple. The idea is that we integrate into community. And when we integrate into a community, we can do this on 3 different levels. The first one is that we feel like we can do what the community asks us to do. So if you think about your discipline and the thing that you're interested in, can you actually do that? Do you feel efficacy around that thing? The second element is, do you feel like you belong there? So when a group matters to you, you start to feel like you belong, that it's part of your identity. When somebody asks you who you are, you say, I am this, right? And that means that that group is kind of, you're connecting to it in a different way. And the deepest level in which we can integrate into a community is when their values are your values. You start to integrate the values of that group. So in this group here, if you think about it, what are the norms of the SACNAS group? What are the norms? What are the things that you have to do in order to be in this room, that you have to feel capable of doing? Do you feel like you belong here? And are the values of this group something that you hold? Even when you're walking out in the room and you're in a department and you're all by yourself, are the values of this group still with you? If you say yes to all those things, you can do it, you belong here, and you feel, internalize those values, then this group really matters to you. That means that you're really integrated into this group. And sometimes we don't have that same experience with our discipline communities. That's why when we come here, we feel restored, right? We feel reinforced, we feel connected. And when we don't have that, we feel disconnected. So I wanted to collect data to show this. There was a lot of emphasis when I started this research on efficacy, whether you can do the science, whether you can do the engineering, whether you can do the mathematics. And there was a lot of emphasis on interventions that we can just build the efficacy. If we can just teach these brown people how to do it, then they'll be able to do it, right? But what I found is that when I was talking to people and when I reflected on my own self, I didn't leave academia because I couldn't do it. I knew I could do it. Is there anybody here who feels they can't do it? Right, everybody knows they can do it. We leave because we're sick and tired of the social environment that we're in. And I wanted to show that. So, and this is evidence. So this was the initial evidence in the initial paper that I gave. And what it shows is that the development of identity and the development of values, that's the red and those blue lines, are stronger, unique predictors of minorities. These are all underrepresented minorities. It's all Latinos and African American and Native American students in this study. And that for our population, developing that sense of identity around our discipline and internalizing the values were much stronger predictors of us continuing than the efficacy issue. It doesn't mean that efficacy doesn't matter. I mean, it does matter that we can do it, right? And we will leave if we can't do it. But when it comes to making decisions about our future, the social environment, the development of that social identity around our discipline really, really matters. So if you're a student, getting into circumstances like this where you can develop that identity, super important. If you're running programs, intentionally finding ways to build the identity is really important. If you are running institutions, you're a president, provost, all those kinds of things, shifting your environment to do that is really, really important. Okay, so taking that same study and looking at what happens 4 years later, so the data back here was really about 1 year after graduation. So I have a recent publication that just looks at what happens 4 years later, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just basically what it's telling you here is that people who have quality mentorship and at least 2 experiences of research as an undergraduate are more likely to develop the sense of efficacy, identity, and values, but that 4 years later, when you ask whether they've stayed in STEM or not, it is that science identity that's really the strongest unique predictor. So again, that developing an identity around your discipline, that's a really important thing for people who stay in. If you don't develop that, then it's harder to stay in, and people are more likely to leave. Okay, so that study informed the next thing. I was working with John Matsui here at the Biology Scholars Program. Now, the Biology Scholars Program has been around for over 23 years. It has national recognition as being a really successful program, building talent, taking students, working with students who are mostly about 75% first generation, many of them underrepresented from underrepresented groups, and really changing their trajectory so that they really are successful at UC Berkeley. But he wanted to know why that was happening. And I can't go into all the details of it, but this program really was an interesting opportunity to look and see if I could take this model that we had looked at the national level and see if to help us understand a specific program. So this is just the one slide I was going to show you from this. One of the interesting things is we surveyed the students that were in the Biology Scholars Program, which is that dark blue line. And then we also surveyed students that were in the Biology 1A and Chem 1A classes at UC Berkeley. And we divided those students into students who were very likely, had high intentions to stay in sciences, which is that light blue line. And then we had students who were low intentions, and then we looked at the biology scholars to see where they fell in this. And so what you can see is that the biology scholars students have endorsed the scientific values. They have science identity levels and efficacy that's really comparable to the Berkeley students who have high intentions to continue on, compared to those who have low intentions. But the one place where they're different is that they experience a lot more stereotype threat in their school. So in spite of them feeling this at the larger institution, something about being in the Biology Scholars Program is preserving their sense of identity and values and efficacy. And I see this in other programs too, but this is where we have kind of the strongest, clear evidence of it. So what happens? I think one of the things that's going on is that programs and things like this create a little world. They create a community. They create interconnection that allows us to build those sense of identity and values and efficacy. But we also know that it breaks down, right? How many of you are going to go back to an institution where you don't feel that? Where you don't feel connected to your discipline? That's pretty good if you guys think that you're going back to a place it sounds like most of you look like you're connected. Maybe that's because most of you are in SACNAS groups, right? You're going to go back to your SACNAS community. That says something about SACNAS. That's good. That's actually really good. So my recent work has been on why things break down. So if you have had the experience of not feeling connected, one of the things that can happen is that you can feel a lot of threat in your environment. So when you feel threat, right, you can feel macroaggression, right? We can feel that a lot right now because of the way the world is, right? The way things are happening in the United States right now. There's macroaggression, and then there's also microaggressions. How many of you have heard about microaggressions? Okay, great. So that can happen, right? You have these subtle ways in which people are kind of undermining you. So I want to introduce this idea of kindness, though. We talk about getting rid of all the negative stuff, but we don't really talk about how to build the positive stuff. And I, as a social psychologist, as someone who studies how important it is to be connected to people, I think you can get rid of all of the negative stuff that we have, but if we don't build the positive, it's not going to work. So there's this idea of kindness, right? That there can be macro affirmations, and there can be micro affirmations. And those are subtle ways in which we get affirmed from people, and then the macro is kind of the more obvious way. And one of the things that I have been seeing as I go and talk around the United States is that a lot of the academic institutions right now are really struggling to attain this inclusiveness. And I was trying to grasp and figure out a way to explain what it's like to be an underrepresented person in an institution and why maybe it's not working. So for years we had what I would call a very prejudiced institutional environment where there was macro and micro aggressions happening and very low macro and micro affirmations happening. And I would say that a lot of people now, maybe not in this room, but when I go to universities, many students feel, underrepresented minority students feel, that they're in an ambiguous institutional environment right now. That is, there's low macro aggression. It's not obvious, people aren't obviously aggressive, but there's a high amount of microaggressions that people experience on a day-to-day basis. There is high macro affirmation. You go in, there's posters, there's, we're diverse, we have a diversity committee, we're really into this. As a university, that's really what we're going for. But their day-to-day experiences are very low micro affirmation. And what happens is that then you're getting a mixed message, right? They're saying we want you, but then at this other level, you're not getting it in the classroom with the professor or with your colleagues. And ambiguous environments for us at a mental level are very exhausting. Because when you have ambiguous information at a social level, you don't know whether you're safe or not. And you're scanning, and you're using a lot of cognitive capacity to check the environment to know whether it's okay or not. And that's one of the reasons why this room feels restorative, because you know this isn't an ambiguous room, right? This is a pretty inclusive room. You know probably most people in here are feeling pretty included. They're feeling micro and macro affirmation and very low aggression. And because of that, you get to relax, and your brain gets to relax, and your body gets to relax, and you get to think in a different way, and it is restorative. How many of you feel restored from the week? Yeah? Okay, good. So what this says is that in terms of being a student, being a faculty member, being an administrator, what we're trying to do is shift it, right? We're trying to move us from an ambiguous to an inclusive environment. And that means each of us as an individual has opportunities to be inclusive of each other, to be inclusive of classmates when we're in our schools, be inclusive of our colleagues, to not add to the aggression, but to really move into that affirmation. All right, so I didn't know if I had time for this last slide, but I think I do, if I get my extra minute here. So one thing I've been thinking about, that last piece is really from the recent article that I wrote, and this one is unwritten yet. So I like to have new things on here. This is not set in stone. I'm writing about it right now. If you have ideas or thoughts or ways to refine this, I'm happy to listen to you. Send me an email. But I've been thinking a lot about how in health, there's been a real push from just treating a person's body to make them healthy to a more kind of holistic idea about health. What does that mean? That means that we now know that people who are relaxed, their immune systems work differently. We know that our system for digesting food influences our hormones. We know that all of these physical systems work together and influence each other, and there's a lot of holistic treatments now that not just tending to the body, but tend to the mind and the heart, and sometimes even the spirit. There's a lot of research on meditation and how that helps us to be less stressed, how this attends to our health. And I think it's interesting that in the academic world, we have been really focused on how to tend to the brain, right? How do we get more and more facts into our brains? But one of the things that it leaves out is our heart. It leaves out our spirit. And so there's been this term that's been kind of bouncing around about inclusive excellence. And I feel like there's a lot of talk about trying to get there, but we haven't really talked about what that looks like, what we would want it to be like. What would a really inclusively excellent institution be like? So I'm proposing that it's holistic, that it doesn't just tend to one part of who we are, but it tends to all pieces of us. At the heart level, that we have a sense of kindness and belonging in our environment. That at the mind level, that we're intellectually stimulated, that we're learning, and that we feel challenged by the intellectual world. That there is representation at the body level, that there's physical representation of people like us. It just helps to have people that have a similar background and have a similar life experience. And then at the spirit level, that we all equally have opportunity for creativity and for meaning making, because those things are really critical. The last thing I want to say is that this whole person kind of concept of education and really of society is innate. It's innate to our communities. And I think one of the reasons why we have struggled so much is because we go into this academic environment that only allows us to build on one piece of ourselves, and we feel like we're leaving pieces other places. We can't bring it in, and it's exhausting. Also, we're facing huge things in the world right now. Right? We have global climate change happening. I mentioned that I was working on that. I went to the Global Climate Action Summit. The room was almost entirely white, very much male. Almost everybody was into money. It was a very selfish environment. And the whole time I could think of was, this place is missing color. This place is missing values of a whole person. And you remember at the very beginning I talked about the interconnection element. That deep knowledge about interconnection that you bring to your work, to your studies, to your writing, to your contribution, it is necessary for us to address the challenges that we have in the world right now at every level. Without it, we are not going to solve the problems. I am sure of it. And I told them that when I was at the summit. I was like, you know what, you're not going to be able to solve these problems from a place of selfishness. The whole person, the heart, mind, and soul, it takes us away from being selfish. It takes us to a place of wanting to help and improve this world. So So you've heard it many times over the last couple days. Oh, we need you. We need you. I think that you hear that over and over again because it's true. We really need you. And I have to say that I am looking to you, the younger generation, to really dismantle this siloed approach to things and to bring to our science, to our research, to our writing, this sense of interconnectedness, not just as a theoretical nice little thing, but actually as something that's essential to undermine all of our writing and our research and the work that we're doing. The interconnectedness is the answer. I am sure of it. As long as we're denying that, we're going to act from a selfish place, and we can't solve the problem. You know, global climate change, that is the Earth's fever, right? It's the Earth's fever. What is causing the Earth's fever? I think it's selfishness. And I think the antidote is kindness. Kindness to ourselves, kindness to each other, kindness in the way that we think and do and act. I seriously think that it is the answer. Heart, love, those good things, right? So as I leave, I ask you sometime today to say thank you to someone who was here, who did something kind for you. Remind them of how important that is. And if you have a chance to tell someone that you love them, tell them you love them. If you get a chance to be kind to someone and not even be noticed, I think that's a good thing too. Let's be our best selves, because I think our best selves in this room has a lot of answers to the problems that are facing our time. Thank you so much.